to top of LNG exporter ranks on breakneck growth. And it notes that U.S. tied Qatar to export 81.2 million tons in 2022. Europe rushes to buy more LNG amid shift away from Russian gas. Bloomberg reports, and I should stress, Bloomberg is a financial media outlet owned by the right-wing billionaire oligarch Michael Bloomberg. He's so modest that he named it after himself. So just for people who don't follow the financial press. Bloomberg notes, the U.S. tied Qatar as the world's top exporter of liquefied natural gas in 2022. They said this is a milestone for the meteoric rise of the United States as a major supplier of the fuel. Both the U.S. and Qatar exported 81.2 million tons, and they note that this is a huge leap for the United States, which only began exporting LNG from the lower 48 states in 2016 and has seemingly overnight become a dominant force in the industry. And they have an incredible graph here, which, I already showed the graph from the US EIA, showing the graph of just US LNG exports, but here's the graph of US LNG exports compared to Qatar, which historically has been the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, followed by Australia. But in just a few years, the US is now tied with Qatar, and it's expected to soon surpass Qatar, potentially. Bloomberg notes that the global energy crisis and a shift away from Russian pipeline gas has increased demand for US LNG. They don't mention, of course, that Russian pipeline gas was significantly cheaper for Europe, and this is a main factor in the global inflation crisis, and it has led to skyrocketing energy prices inside Europe. So if you look at this data here, as recently as 2014, the U.S. exported 0 tons of liquefied natural gas. In 2015, it slightly increased to 0.3 million, and then 2016 to 3.5 million. But between 2016, that has massively increased now to 81.2 million tons as of 2022. This is just an unprecedented increase. And Bloomberg notes that the U.S. would have been an even larger exporter than Qatar if not for a fire at the Freeport export plant in Texas, which led to the plant being shut down. So clearly, U.S. fossil fuel corporations are making a ton of money from this massive increase in exports. And meanwhile, who have become the biggest customers? Europe. And Europe is paying significantly more for this U.S. LNG. This is a report in a website called LNG Prime, which is a website focused on the LNG market. And they published a report in July titled, France and Spain remain biggest importers of U.S. LNG. They note France was the top destination for U.S. LNG exports for several months in a row. And it notes that Europe continues to receive most of the volumes produced at U.S. liquefaction terminals, according to a report by the U.S. Department of Energy. So France, as of mid-2022, France was the largest importer, followed by Spain, the Netherlands, then Japan, and Italy. These 5 countries, again, that is France, Spain, Netherlands, Japan, and Italy, took nearly half of total U.S. LNG exports, 46%, as of May 2022. So this is a pretty monumental shift when you compare it to just a year before. This is another report at the S&P Global website with focusing on intelligence on commodities markets. And it's from September. It's titled, European Imports of U.S. LNG Make Up Lion's Share of Over $21 billion in the first half of 2022 exports. I'm going to go through this report, but first I'm going to show this graph here, which is, if you look at it, if you know how to read it in a certain way, it's actually a pretty remarkable graph. Now, at first glance, it doesn't seem like that big of a shift because this graph shows the regions of the world that receive U.S. LNG exports, the regions that import U.S. LNG, and you can see that Asia had been the largest market. And of course, Asia is the largest continent in the world, although again, it's really just Eurasia. But if we're looking at political distinctions of continents, because the number of actual continents is in dispute. In some education systems, they teach that there are 6, 7, 5. They'll say Eurasia, they'll say the Americas, they'll say Eurasia and Africa combined. Anyway, the point is that continents are not like a neatly divided geological construct. They're largely political. They're socially constructed. Anyway, the point is here that Asia is by far the largest region of the world. Europe's population is significantly smaller, so it makes sense that Asia, for the past 3 years, until 2022, would have been the largest market for US LNG. However, if you zoom in on the graph and you just look at the data from the past 2 years, you can see the incredible impact of the proxy war in Ukraine on Europe's energy imports and therefore its economy and inflation. You can see that in the past year, Asia went from being the largest market for US LNG to being replaced by Europe. Europe now makes up the lion's share. It is the largest market for US LNG. And again, this is because Europe has economically been shooting itself in the foot by boycotting significantly cheaper Russian pipeline gas and buying significantly more expensive US LNG. Okay, now let's go back to this report in S&P Global, its market intelligence unit. European imports of US LNG make up lion's share of over 21 billion in the first half of 2022 exports. Surging demand for US liquefied natural gas saw the total dollar value of cargoes exported during the first half of the year nearly double from the same period in 2021. Global imports of US LNG totaled more than 21.2 billion in the first 6 months of 2022, compared to 10.8 billion in the first 6 months of 2021. Again, that is a nearly 100% increase. It's nearly double. This graph shows the total export of liquefied natural gas, US liquefied natural gas, and then the value. And you can see that yes, the total exports have increased, but the value has significantly increased more. Why is that? Because the price of LNG has skyrocketed. Europe is paying, significantly more than it was before. And again, this has led to a global inflation crisis. Now, S&P Global notes that Europe leads imports. Many US LNG export cargoes departed for Europe in the first half of 2022 as the war in Ukraine prompted a scramble for LNG supplies. And they note that LNG market experts have warned that shipments of LNG cannot quickly replace curtailed pipeline imports from Russia, and that the region's need for significant LNG volumes will remain strong. So Europe is becoming more and more dependent on much more expensive US LNG in order to end its dependence on much cheaper Russian pipeline gas. So, of course, the US is benefiting from this and smiling all along because the Europe says we can't be dependent on Russia. What they're not saying is that they're becoming completely dependent on the US and causing an economic crisis in their own countries. At the same time, it's not a coincidence, S&P Global notes, European gas prices have remained higher than anywhere else in the world. So Europe is importing more and more US LNG and paying more and more. And as of August 2022, the benchmark price in Europe for energy was 320 euros of megawatts per megawatts per hour. So at this time, the euro was close to the US dollar. They were almost at parity. So that's about 320 around there US dollars, more than 300 US dollars per megawatt per hour. That is insanely expensive. S&P Global also points out that France was the top destination for US LNG, followed by Spain and then by Britain. So Britain has become another major importer of US LNG. The largest import of US LNG outside of Europe is South Korea, the 5th largest overall. Now, if you don't believe me that Europe is paying the cost for this increase in U.S. LNG exports and the proxy war in Ukraine, or more specifically, not just Europe, the people of Europe, the working class people of Europe who have to pay insanely high energy bills. Here's a report from Reuters that was just published this December. It's titled, U.S. LNG Exports Both a Lifeline and a Drain for Europe in 2023. It notes that record liquefied natural gas exports from the U.S., of course it's LNG, helped soften the blow to Europe from sharply lower Russian pipeline natural gas supplies in 2022, and U.S. LNG will remain a vital energy source for Europe in 2023. So again, this is not just temporary. But Reuters points out the surging cost of U.S. LNG, which have roughly doubled since late 2021. Again, the cost of U.S. LNG in roughly the past year has doubled. Now, Reuters has a really good graph here that shows the countries or regions that provide, that are suppliers of natural gas for Europe. And you can see that in 2021, Russia was the largest supplier of natural gas to Europe, although Norway was a significant supplier. But Norway only can supply a certain amount. It's limited. It has a maximum cap. So you can see that what made up for the decline in Russian natural gas exports with the escalation of the proxy war in Ukraine and the European pledge to boycott Russian energy, well, it was U.S. LNG. Next to the bar graph, you see the line graph, and they show that as Russian gas supplies to Europe significantly decreased from nearly 50%, from over 40% to basically zero, close to zero. And as of December, that was the deadline for the European boycott of Russian energy. At least they ended up putting a price cap. And you can see that while Russian supplies have plummeted basically to zero, U.S. LNG supplies have increased from just over 10% to over 50%. That is to say now that over half of the natural gas supplied to Europe comes from U.S. LNG, which once again is significantly more expensive than the Russian pipeline gas. Reuters points out that U.S. LNG exporters boosted shipments to Europe by more than 137% in the first 11 months of 2022 compared to 2021. A 137% increase. They add that the United States looks set to remain Europe's top LNG seller in 2023 as U.S. LNG exporters have greater volumes of LNG available for spot market purchase than other major exporters like Qatar. What does that mean? It means that, again, countries like Qatar or Norway, they have a limit to how much gas or oil they can export, right? Because they have to pump it, they have to produce it, they have to refine it. So, I mean, if they're refining it, sometimes they're not. But anyway, the point is they have a limit, right? So a lot of countries like Qatar probably already have contracts with a series of countries around the world, which means they can't really increase production that much. So they can't really export a lot of additional LNG to regions like Europe. But the U.S. has much more LNG. Because the U.S. has been massively increasing its production of LNG, it has much more available that it can just sell in the spot market. The spot market is where countries that don't have long-term contracts, if they want to buy more oil or gas, they can go to the spot market. Although the spot market purchases tend to be more expensive than the long-term contracts because oftentimes the long-term contracts are set at a price which is below the current market value. And they benefit because they have stability, and then the exporters benefit because they have a guaranteed market, guaranteed consumer of their gas or oil. Now, these graphs from Reuters also show the U.S. LNG exports by destination, and you can see that this is similar to the graph I was showing before, how previously Asia had been the largest market for U.S. LNG, and very quickly, in just the span of a year, Europe has replaced Asia as the largest market for U.S. LNG by far now. I mean, it's a massive shift. And Qatar, you can see its LNG exports have been pretty consistent. And again, Asia is the largest market, which makes sense because Asia has the largest population. And you can see that there's not much variation here. And that's probably because a lot of countries just have